Okay, so let's think about two things that seem, well, miles apart. Scientific research, labs and telescopes, and then empire building, conquest, expansion, all that.
Yeah, on the surface, totally different worlds.
But back in the early modern period, something really interesting happened. These two things got deeply connected in ways that were, frankly, world-changing and sometimes, well, pretty disturbing.
Absolutely. And that's the core question for today, isn't it? How did this, like, unlikely partnership between science and empire end up powering European dominance and basically shaping the world we're living in right now?
That's exactly it. So we're going to be digging into some source material that really shines a light on this connection, how the scientific revolution and the rise of European empires weren't really separate tracks.
More like two sides of the same coin, you could say, feeding off each other.
Right. And our mission for this deep dive is to really get under the hood of that relationship. What drove it? How did it actually work in practice? And crucially, what are the echoes today? Because understanding this history, it gives you a totally different lens on the present.
Definitely. It provides so much context.
Okay, let's jump in. I think a really powerful way to start is with Captain Cook's voyages.
Oh, absolutely. Cook's expeditions, particularly the ones to observe the transit of Venus, back in 1761 and 1769, they're almost a perfect microcosm of this whole dynamic.
Okay, so explain that a bit. The Royal Society, right? The scientific angle.
Exactly. You've got the Royal Society in London, driven by this massive scientific question, how far is the Earth from the sun? A fundamental piece of knowledge. And to get the answer, they needed observations from different parts of the world simultaneously. So it was inherently a global scientific project.
Wow. So right away, it's got this huge geographical scale.
Huge. But it wasn't just, one guy with a telescope.
Right. That's what's interesting. Cook's ship, the Endeavour, it wasn't just carrying an astronomer, Charles Green. It had botanists.
Joseph Banks and Daniel Solander, yeah. Big names.
And artists, too, right? To draw plants, animals, people.
Exactly. It shows this broadening scope of scientific interests, not just astronomy, but natural history, anthropology, geography, a whole suite of disciplines.
But where does the empire part come in so clearly?
Well, who provided the ship? The Royal Navy. Who provided the crew? Armed sailors and Marines, they had cannons.
Ah, okay. So this wasn't just some university field trip.
Not at all. It was a scientific mission, yes, but it was equipped, funded, and protected by the military might of the British Empire.
Yeah.
The two were completely intertwined from the outset.
And there were even, direct scientific benefits that helped the empire, weren't there? Like the scurvy thing.
Oh, absolutely. Dr. Lin's experiments had suggested citrus fruits could prevent scurvy, this terrible disease that killed so many sailors. Cook actually implemented this. He made his crew eat sauerkraut and citrus.
Kind of like a clinical trial at sea.
Pretty much. And it worked remarkably well. It drastically reduced deaths from scurvy. Which, sounds like just a health benefit, but think about it.
It makes long voyages possible, more reliable.
Exactly. It massively boosted Britain's ability to project power across the oceans, keep fleets at sea for longer, sustain blockades, transport troops. A huge strategic advantage born from a scientific insight.
Wow. Okay. But then there's the other side of the coin, the darker side.
Yes. And this is where it gets really stark. While doing all the science, Cook was also acting as an agent of the empire. He claimed vast territories for Britain, most famously Australia.
Declaring it terra nullius, nobody's land, even though people were clearly living there.
Precisely. His voyages paved the way for colonization, for European settlement, and the consequences for the indigenous peoples were catastrophic.
You mean the Australian Aborigines, the Maori in New Zealand?
Yes, and the Tasmanians. Decimation through disease, violence, displacement. The Tasmanians were driven to extinction within a century. It's a horrifying story.
And even after death, they weren't left in peace.
No. Their bodies, their skeletons, were collected, studied, displayed in museums, treated as scientific specimens. It's a really chilling example of how science could be used even after death in the service of, or at least in parallel with, imperial objectives.
So it really throws that question into sharp relief, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Was it a scientific voyage with a bit of military backup?
Or was it fundamentally a military and imperial expedition that also did some useful science along the way?
And the answer seems to be.
It was both. You just can't untangle them. Science needed the empire for access, for funding, for protection. Empire used science for practical advantages, for navigation, for mapping resources, and eventually, as we'll see, for justification. It was a symbiotic relationship.
Okay, so Cook is a really potent example. But let's pull back a bit. The sources make a really interesting point, challenging the idea that Europe's rise to dominance, especially before, say, 1850, was all down to better technology.
Yeah, that's a common assumption, isn't it? That Europe just had better gadgets.
Hmm.
But if you look at the world around, say 1775, the economic powerhouses were actually in Asia.
Like the Ottoman Empire, the Mughals in India.
Right, the Safavids in Persia, the Ming and later Qing dynasties in China. Together, Asia accounted for something like 80% of the entire global economy then. Europe was relatively peripheral, economically speaking.
80%. That's staggering.
Hmm.
So technology alone doesn't explain the shift, because obviously a massive shift did happen between roughly 1750 and 1850.
Exactly. The power balance flipped dramatically. So if it wasn't just having the tech, what was it? The sources suggest it was more about the underlying, well, the whole system. Values, myths, legal structures, the way society was organized.
How they use the technology.
Precisely. Take railroads, for instance. The steam engine, the basic tech, wasn't some secret European magic.
Okay.
But by 1850, Europe and the U.S. had laid down almost 40,000 kilometers of track. Asia, Africa, Latin America combined, only about 4,000 kilometers.
Wow, that's a huge difference. Why?
Well, in China, for example, when the first railroad was built, the government actually had it dismantled pretty quickly. There wasn't the same political will, the financial structures, maybe the belief in that kind of progress to really embrace and scale it up, like in the West.
So it's about the societal software, not just the hardware.
That's a great way to put it. Europe developed this unique potential to harness scientific breakthroughs and technological innovations within its particular social and political framework, which included, crucially, that imperial drive.
Which brings us back to that connection. The sources argue that modern science didn't just happen alongside empires, it actually flourished because of them, within them.
Yes, while acknowledging, of course, that science builds on older traditions from all over the world. But modern science, as we know it, really took off in that imperial context.
And there's this idea of a shared mindset between the scientist and the conqueror. What's that about?
It starts, interestingly, with admitting ignorance.
Ignorance. How so?
Well, think about it. Both the explorer, setting out for unknown lands, and the scientist investigating an unknown phenomenon begin by saying, we don't know what's out there, but we want to find out.
Okay, I see that. A willingness to admit you don't have all the answers.
Exactly. Coupled with this intense curiosity, this compulsion to go and discover, and crucially, the belief, or maybe the hope, that the new knowledge gained will lead to mastery. Mastery over nature for the scientist, mastery over territory, and people for the conqueror.
That's a really provocative parallel. How was that different from earlier empires? Weren't they curious?
Well, yes, but their primary goal was usually to consolidate power and wealth within their existing worldview. They weren't typically driven by this systematic quest for fundamentally new knowledge in the same way. European imperialism was unique in that it explicitly sought new knowledge alongside new territories. The two quests became intertwined.
Can you give an example?
Napoleon in Egypt is a classic one. He didn't just bring soldiers, he brought a whole legion of scholars, linguists, historians, artists, engineers.
Right, the birth of Egyptology.
Exactly. Or Darwin on the Beagle. The ship's main mission was hydrographic surveys, mapping coastlines for the British Navy and imperial task. But Darwin's observations during that voyage fundamentally changed our understanding of life itself. Science piggybacking on empire.
It's everywhere once you look for it. There's that anecdote in the source about the Apollo 11 astronauts, isn't there?
Oh, right. The story about the Native American elder asked for a message to take to the moon, and he gives them this warning for the moon spirits about the white men coming to take their lands.
Yeah, it's kind of darkly funny, but it really lands that point, doesn't it? How that explore and conquer mentality looks from the other side.
It really does. A stark reminder of the perspective of the colonized.
So this admission of ignorance was key. Let's dig into that a bit more, especially with maps.
Okay, yeah, the maps are fascinating. Before the modern era, most world maps, whether European, Chinese, Arab, whatever, they tended to fill everything in.
Even if they didn't really know what was there.
Exactly. They'd populate unknown areas with mythical beasts, imaginary kingdoms, maybe just draw the edge of the world. The map projected a sense of completeness, of knowing the whole world, even if based on tradition or guesswork.
But European maps started changing. When? 15th, 16th centuries.
Right around the Age of Discovery, you start seeing maps with big empty spaces, blank areas labeled terra incognita, unknown land.
And that wasn't just a lack of artistry.
No, it was a profound conceptual shift. It was Europeans admitting, graphically, there are huge parts of the world we know absolutely nothing about. It was an admission of ignorance printed on paper.
Which must have been quite radical.
Hugely radical. Think about Columbus. He sails west, bumps into the Americas, but he struggles to accept it's a new continent.
Because his maps, his worldview, said Asia should be there.
Exactly. His mental map was complete. The idea that the Bible, the ancient Greeks, generations of scholars could have missed half the planet was almost unthinkable for him. He tried to fit his discovery into the old framework.
But then comes Amerigo Vespucci.
Right. And Vespucci looked at the evidence, the observations, and said, no, wait, this doesn't match Asia. This is something new, something unknown.
And they named it after him. America.
Yeah. And the source presents this moment, Vespucci's willingness to prioritize observation over tradition, to accept ignorance and embrace a radical new discovery as a crucial step towards the scientific revolution itself. It's about trusting empirical evidence over ancient texts.
So admitting you don't know is the first step to actually finding things out.
Precisely. And that acceptance of incomplete knowledge, that drive to fill in the blank spots, not just on maps, but in understanding generally, became this powerful engine. An engine for both science and for going out and, well, claiming those blank spots.
Which fueled this ambition for, as you said, long-distance exploration and conquest, something the source really stresses as being historically unusual.
Yes, it's worth emphasizing how weirdly unique this European behavior was. Most empires historically expanded gradually, dealing with their neighbors.
Like the Roman Empire slowly absorbing surrounding territories over centuries.
Exactly. That slow creep, the idea of just hopping in a boat, sailing for months across a vast ocean to a place you know almost nothing about, planting a flag and saying, this is ours now.
That was new.
And pretty audacious.
Were there other long-distance voyages? Like the Chinese admiral Zheng He?
Good point. Voyages in the early 15th century were incredible feats of navigation and naval technology, way ahead of the Europeans at the time. Huge fleets, massive ships.
So why wasn't China the great colonizer?
Crucially, Zheng, he wasn't trying to conquer or colonize distant lands. His missions were more about diplomacy, trade, projecting Chinese prestige. And perhaps even more importantly, after a few decades, a political shift happened in China, and the emperors just stopped the voyages. They dismantled the fleets.
Wow, so the ambition wasn't there, or it didn't last.
Exactly. There wasn't that same relentless, almost obsessive European fever to explore, map, and claim distant, unknown territories. That combination seems to have been uniquely European in that era.
And the impact on the people already living in those blank spots.
Devastating. Think about the Spanish arriving in Mexico and Peru. The Aztec and Inca empires were sophisticated, powerful societies.
But they had no idea the Spanish were coming or what they represented.
Pretty much. Their worldview was more regional. They didn't know about the wider Atlantic world, about what the Spanish had already done in the Caribbean. It was, as the source puts it, almost like an alien invasion. They were completely unprepared for the nature and scale of the threat.
And the consequences were swift and brutal.
Incredibly so. Disease was a major factor. Smallpox, measles, things Europeans had some immunity to, but which ripped through Native American populations who had no prior exposure.
Killing millions.
Millions upon millions.
Yeah.
Estimates suggest maybe 90% of the indigenous population in the Americas died within a century or so of European contact, plus warfare, enslavement, the destruction of their societies. It's one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in human history.
It's horrifying to contemplate.
Right.
And the source mentions that the big Asian powers kind of missed the boat on this. They didn't engage much.
Largely, yes. They were still very much focused on their own spheres. They saw these European explorations in faraway lands as somewhat peripheral, not realizing the global power shift that was underway. They maintained a more, you could say, Asia-centric view for a long time.
Until when? When did that change?
Really, not until the 20th century. That's when non-European cultures truly adopted a global perspective, often forged in the struggle against European colonialism itself. Think of the independence movements in Algeria, Vietnam, India. They started playing the global game.
And the source poses that interesting what if, right?
Oh.
What if Montezuma had understood global politics?
Yeah, what if he'd known what was happening, sent envoys to Spain, tried to build alliances? It's pure speculation, of course, but it highlights how crucial that global awareness, or lack thereof, was.
So we've got this drive, this mindset, but science wasn't just a parallel activity. It became a tool of empire, right? Embedded in the practice of ruling.
Oh, absolutely. Empire building became, for Europeans, a kind of scientific project itself. Conquered lands weren't just exploited, they were systematically studied, cataloged, mapped.
Like the British in India.
Perfect example. The Great Trigonometrical Survey of India was this monumental undertaking lasting decades to precisely map the entire subcontinent. Incredible scientific achievement measuring the height of Mount Everest.
But also incredibly useful for administration, taxation, military control.
Exactly. And think about archaeology. The British unearthed ancient cities like Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley, revealing civilizations that people in India themselves had forgotten. Or think about Henry Rawlinson, a British army officer deciphering ancient cuneiform script in Persia.
So previous rulers hadn't bothered with that stuff.
Generally, no. Local rulers lived amongst those ruins and inscriptions for centuries without that same systematic scientific drive to excavate and decipher them. It was part of that European knowledge-gathering impulse linked to imperial power.
And linguistics, too.
Yes. William Jones, working for the British East India Company, studying Sanskrit, he realizes its connections to Greek and Latin, essentially founding comparative linguistics. Why? Initially, because the British needed to understand local laws and languages to govern effectively.
So practical needs drove scientific breakthroughs.
Often, yes. And this accumulation of knowledge, geographical, historical, linguistic, anthropological, gave the imperial powers a huge advantage. They understood the lands and peoples they ruled, often better in a systematic way than local populations or previous rulers did. Information is power.
But science provided more than just practical tools. It also gave them justification, an ideology.
A very powerful one. All this knowledge gathering, the mapping, the classifying, it was framed as progress, as bringing enlightenment. Imperial powers constructed this narrative that they were bringing the benefits of Western civilization, medicine, science, order, education to supposedly backward peoples.
The white man's burden idea.
Precisely. Kipling's poem captures that perfectly, this sense of duty, however self-serving, to civilize the rest of the world. Science was presented as a core part of that civilizing mission.
Even though the reality on the ground could be brutal exploitation, like the Bengal famine you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. The narrative of progress often masked the harsh realities of resource extraction, economic disruption, political oppression, and violence. It's a deeply complex legacy. The empires did bring changes, sometimes including infrastructure or certain types of knowledge, but always within a framework of domination and often at immense human cost.
We can't just paint it as purely good or purely evil.
No, it's far too complex. These empires fundamentally reshaped the entire planet, including the very way we think about progress, culture, and history today.
And one of the ugliest intersections was how science got twisted to justify racism.
Yes, that's a really dark chapter. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, emerging scientific disciplines, biology, anthropology, craniology, linguistics, were actively used, or rather misused, to create pseudoscientific theories of racial hierarchy.
To prove that Europeans were inherently superior.
Exactly. Measuring skulls, analyzing languages, studying physical traits, all interpreted through a lens of preconceived bias to support the idea that white Europeans were biologically destined to rule over other, supposedly inferior races. The whole theory of the Aryan master race grew out of this toxic mix of nationalism, imperialism, and bad science.
And the consequences were horrific, obviously culminating in things like Nazi ideology.
Absolutely. But the source makes a really interesting point about how even after biological racism was largely discredited scientifically, a similar logic can persist in the form of culturism.
Culturism. What's meant by that?
It's shifting the argument from biology to culture. Instead of saying their race is inferior, the argument becomes their culture is incompatible or their values are backward.
Ah, okay. So you might hear arguments against immigration, for instance, framed not explicitly in racial terms, but saying something like their culture isn't democratic, or their culture doesn't respect women's rights, or it's inherently violent.
Exactly. It uses cultural differences, real or perceived, to justify exclusion or hierarchy, much like biological racism did. Instead of it's in their blood, it becomes it's in their culture.
And the effect can be similar, creating an us versus them, justifying prejudice or discrimination.
Precisely. And the source suggests this might be a trickier issue for humanities and social sciences to grapple with. Biology can fairly definitively say race is a social construct, not a biological reality determining superiority.
But culture is different. And studying cultural differences is kind of the point of anthropology or sociology, right?
Right, so it's a fine line. How do you acknowledge and study cultural differences without falling into the trap of creating rigid hierarchies or implying that some cultures are inherently better or more advanced than others in a way that echoes those old imperial justifications? It's an ongoing challenge.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, this deep dive really hammered home just how tangled up modern science and European empire building were.
Absolutely inseparable, really. A feedback loop. Science gave empire practical tools, navigation, medicine, weapons technology, mapping, and also, crucially, that ideological justification.
Yet empire, in return, gave science, funding, access.
Funding, yes, but also unprecedented access to global data plants, animals, peoples, languages, ruins from all over the world. It provided the raw material and the global stage for scientific inquiry, and it fueled that drive for discovery.
It was a symbiotic relationship, as you said.
Truly, you likely wouldn't have had one without the other, not in the form they took.
And the legacy is, well, it's the world we live in, isn't it? The global spread of science, the dominance of certain economic models like capitalism. These are direct descendants of that era. The empires might be gone, formally at least.
But the structures and ways of thinking they established have had a remarkably long afterlife. Science and capitalism, nurtured within that imperial crucible, are now global phenomena.
So as people have listened to this, what are the big takeaways? What does understanding this history do for how we see things now?
Well, it prompts reflection, doesn't it? How does this knowledge change how you view international relations or scientific funding or even cultural exchanges today? Can you see the echoes of that marriage of science and empire playing out?
It definitely makes you think.
Yeah.
And maybe look at current exploration space, deep sea, AI, with a different eye.
That's the final thought, really. The old empires faded, but that drive to explore, to know, to potentially control, that seems deeply ingrained. What are the new frontiers we're pushing into today, and what are the unforeseen consequences, the potential new forms of empire or scientific overreach that we might be blind to right now?
A powerful question to leave us with. It certainly puts things into a much broader and perhaps more sobering context.